Hi, I'm just about to go and do my class at the Red Corner Gym, my self-defense class. But I don't feel that I answered the question earlier about stress. I explained what stress was, but I've been thinking about it, and sometimes people need strategies to change if they're getting stressed, to change, the way they react to things. So I was thinking earlier, the example I gave, if you haven't watched it, you probably won't know what I'm talking about, but the film just before this was explaining about stress and the impact it has on us. So, the example that I gave was, sometimes I get stressed when I think that I'm going to be late. So, and I was explaining that how I played this story, when I looked at, okay, why are you getting stressed? What difference does it make if you're late? I started to question my story. The story that I attach to being late, which is really important. So anyone out there that's getting stressed, I would really advise that you start questioning the story. Okay, so why am I getting stressed over this situation? What's going to happen? And then what? And then what? And then what? And what will happen then is you'll pick up on the story that you attach to it. So the example that I gave about being late, part of my story, which comes all the way back to childhood, these would have been messages that I picked up as a child, were you shouldn't be late. Okay, so if I am late, that starts to go against this story that I've been given, this life story, this script, whatever you want to call it. We've talked about this before. It's really powerful. So anything that takes you off your script or your life story is going to be really uncomfortable, because that's a deep-seated belief about how you should be and how you see yourself. And there's a key word here that I'm using a lot, and that's should. Whenever I hear people use the word should, my ears pick up, and I'll home straight in on that straight away and start questioning the should word. Why should you? So using the example earlier of being stressed, if I'm late, then I can start to feel stressed because my story is that I should never be late. But if you think about that, that's ridiculous. There's going to be times in your life where you're going to be late. So really, it goes back to what we've said loads of times in these video clips. You've got to start questioning your story. It's just a story. And if you question it, sometimes you can actually see how silly it is. But if you believe that story, you're going to stick to that story, and you're not going to do or want to do anything that takes you away from that story. And you'll even actually find out people, and you'll find out circumstances to actually back up your story. You'll hang around people that will back up your story. You won't hang around people that might question your story, which again is a really good thing, but it'll make you feel uncomfortable. I'm a big believer on questioning the story. I like it when people question me, because it makes me question my own story. It's not easy, but it's really important to be able to do that. And I've talked about this before as well. What happens, the science behind this is that whenever you learn anything, you create a neurological pathway in your head. So the example for me about, I should never be late, that will be a really strong pathway in my head. And all these neurons that we've got in our brain, and again, I think there's something like 40 billion of them, they all join together and they create a pathway which becomes just like the M6. You just use it again and again and again. I've done a little drawing here, excuse my drawing, but the top one is, an example of how these neurons join together. This one here will be the first event. So somewhere way back in my life, I would have learnt a lesson of you should never be late. That could be a harsh lesson. It could be just a repetitive lesson, but that's the first example. And then after that, all these little are just examples all throughout my life where I've told myself, or other people have told me, I should never be late. So I stick to the story. I stick to the pathway, and that becomes cemented in my brain. The same as learning to tie your shoelaces, learn a new move in a martial art. What happens, you practice it enough times and then it becomes embedded in your brain. You don't even have to think about it anymore. Takes a while to get there, but once you've done it enough times, some people say 10,000 times, I'm not sure that it takes that long, but if you do it enough times, it becomes embedded in your brain. You've got a neurological pathway. But when we're looking at things that cause us discomfort, we've got to challenge that pathway and break that pathway, and almost like confuse our own minds. If we do that enough times, then we create another pathway. This is the one I've done a little drawing of underneath. And basically this new pathway, if you look at it, I've deliberately drawn it smaller than the old pathway because the old pathway's been there years. It's really strong. So for me, that example, I should never be late, is a really strong pathway. When I start saying, well, why shouldn't I? And what happens if I am? So what if I am late? I'm creating this new pathway here. But it's going to take time, or it takes time for me to develop this new pathway. It's not as strong as the old pathway. You know, anything where you have to learn a new way of doing things. I get people come to my classes that have done different martial arts. My stance, I always teach a lot of stuff that comes from boxing. In boxing, you always stand with your weakest foot forward. So most people are right-handed, right-footed. So I get them to stand with their left foot and their left hand forward. Sometimes in other martial arts, for example, judo, they stand with their right foot forward and their right hand forward, their strongest side, sorry. So to get them to change is really, really hard because they automatically do what they've always done. You'll automatically do what you've always done. So changing that is really hard. It's about embracing uncertainty, going off your story. As human beings, we're scared of uncertainty. We need to embrace it. We need to challenge our stories. Break these pathways, you know. So for me, it's about almost daring to be late sometimes and see what happens. I still don't like it, but I know it's not the end of the world if I'm late. It won't lead to this big catastrophe that I was talking about earlier. So I hope that makes more sense with the stress. This applies to addictions, anxiety, it applies to lots of other things. It's about breaking those pathways that we've created in our head. And none of this is easy. It's not easy, you know, it takes time, it takes a lot of work, but it can definitely be done, you know. In all these neurosurgeons, and they all talk about the brain, they talk about plasticity now, how the brain can be moulded and reshape itself. And it can, but it takes time to do that. So I hope that makes more sense to what I was talking about earlier about the stress. But this applies to everything: addictions, compulsive thinking, anxiety, everything. It's about challenging these pathways and changing them. Lots of different ways to do it, too many to go into here, but you know, I'd be looking at it. Just think about this: every time you use the word should, question it, change it to could, because you're giving yourself choices, you're giving yourself options. With the word should, you're not. If I feel that I should do something and I don't, then I normally beat myself up for it. But if I say, well, I could have done it that way, I'm giving myself a choice and it takes the pressure off. So challenge your stories. It's really important. If you don't, you'll just stick on the same. If you're happy with where you are, you're happy with who you are, brilliant. If you're not, or there's certain areas of your life, like we talked about earlier, you get stressed, start looking at why. You know, what's going on here? Play the story forward. What happens if you carry on doing what you're doing? And then start challenging those old pathways. So I hope that makes a bit of sense, and I hope that makes what I was saying earlier a little bit clearer. I'm just about to go and do my class now, so I need to get going. But thanks for watching. And again, I know I keep saying it, but thanks for the comments and the feedback. It really does help, and it gives me something to work on. And if people want me to work on anything, or talk about anything, just give me a shout. Okay, enjoy your evening.